My name is Elson Carter, and I am 38 years old. If you met my family, you would never guess what they did to me. They smiled. Every day. Warm faces. Polite voices. Friendly jokes. The kind of people strangers trust right away. The kind of family that looks close in photos. The kind that makes other people say, "You're so lucky." And I used to believe that too. I used to think a smile meant safety. But now, when I think about those smiles, I feel sick. Because I finally understand what they really were. Not love. Not kindness. Not warmth. They were cover. They were camouflage. They were a way to hurt me without leaving marks anyone could point to. They smiled at me daily, while quietly destroying me. It didn't start as cruelty. It started as small things that didn't seem worth mentioning. A comment that sounded like a joke but landed like an insult. A compliment that had a sharp edge. A helpful suggestion that made me feel stupid. They did it so smoothly, so calmly. I kept telling myself it wasn't real. I told myself I was sensitive. That word followed me through my whole life. Sensitive. Emotional. Dramatic. Too much. Every time I felt pain, they used that word like a stamp on my forehead. Sensitive. It made my feelings feel embarrassing. It made me question my own memory. It made me swallow what I wanted to say. And that's how they won. Not by yelling. Not by threatening. By making me doubt myself while smiling the whole time. Growing up, I learned early that the mood in the house mattered more than my feelings. If someone was irritated, I needed to adjust. If someone was stressed, I needed to be easier. If someone felt disappointed, I needed to fix it. Nobody asked me to do this. I just learned that when I stayed quiet, the house felt calmer. So, I became the quiet one, the peacemaker, the one who didn't cause problems. My family loved that version of me. They praised it. They told people how mature I was, how thoughtful, how sweet. But what they were really praising was my silence. They were praising how easy it was to step on me. The smiling part is what made it confusing. If they had screamed, I could have called it abuse. If they had hit me, I could have named it. But they didn't do those things. They stayed calm. They stayed charming. They stayed pleasant. That's what made me feel crazy. Because how could people who smiled so much be hurting me? The first time I noticed the pattern clearly, I was a teenager. I had worked hard on something small, but important to me. I remember feeling proud for a moment. Standing there with this tiny spark inside my chest, waiting for them to see it. They smiled. Then they pointed out what was wrong with it. Not harshly, not angrily, just casually, like they were doing me a favor. Like their criticism was love, like my pride was something childish they needed to correct. They smiled as they took that spark and put it out. After that, it happened again and again. Anytime I felt confidence, it was too much. Anytime I felt happy, it was naive. Anytime I felt upset, it was dramatic. Their smiles never changed. Only my inside did. I started walking around with this constant feeling that I was one step away from doing something wrong. Like there were invisible rules I couldn't learn, because they changed depending on who was in charge of the mood. I stopped expressing myself. I stopped asking for things. I stopped sharing dreams because every dream became a joke or a warning. They didn't crush me all at once. They did it slowly, quietly, daily. And the hardest part is that they made it look like love. They smiled while they corrected my tone. They smiled while they questioned my choices. They smiled while they reminded me of my flaws. They smiled while they compared me to other people. They smiled while they acted like they were helping me, when really, they were shaping me into someone who would never threaten their comfort. I began to apologize for everything. For taking up space. For being tired. For being upset. For misunderstanding. For existing too loudly. I learned to soften my voice before I spoke. I learned to laugh when something hurt. I learned to nod even when I felt myself breaking inside. And they liked me best like that. I didn't understand what was happening because they never admitted it. If I tried to talk about how I felt, they smiled and acted confused. They told me I was imagining things. They told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. They told me they were just being honest. They told me I should be grateful they cared enough to correct me. Their smiles were the trick. Because if I reacted, I looked unstable. If I cried, I looked weak. If I got angry, I looked unreasonable. And they stayed calm. They stayed sweet. They stayed smiling. So everyone believed them. Ava May. Over time, I started to feel like my pain was embarrassing. Like my hurt was proof that I was defective. Like the problem was my emotional reaction, not what was being done to me. That belief became their greatest weapon. It kept me quiet. It kept me confused. It kept me loyal. And the destruction wasn't loud. It was invisible. It was the slow loss of confidence, the slow loss of identity, the slow loss of joy. It was waking up one day and realizing I didn't know what I liked anymore, because my whole life had become about avoiding judgment. I didn't see the damage clearly until years later, when I looked back and realized how many times I had been smiling too. Smiling through pain. Smiling through shame. Smiling through loneliness. Smiling so no one would notice what was happening to me. That's what makes this story hard to tell. Because the outside looked fine. People smiled. Pictures looked happy. Holidays looked normal. But behind those smiles was a quiet kind of cruelty that breaks you from the inside out. And the worst part? The day I finally started to wake up, they smiled even wider. At first, I thought each smile stood alone. One comment here. One moment there. One person at a time. I told myself that no one meant harm, that I was just unlucky enough to keep misunderstanding people who loved me. That belief protected them longer than it protected me. What I didn't see yet was that the smiles were starting to line up. It happened so quietly that I missed the exact moment it began. A look shared across the room. A pause before someone answered me. A laugh that came a second too late. Small things. Easy to dismiss. But when you live inside something long enough, your body notices patterns before your mind is brave enough to name them. They started agreeing with each other in ways they never had before. If one of them questioned my choices, another one nodded. If one of them hinted that I was difficult, someone else gently confirmed it. Not harshly, not cruelly, softly, calmly, with smiles still in place. It felt less like an attack and more like a group decision I hadn't been invited to. That's when the damage stopped being personal and started being coordinated. I noticed it most in conversations where I tried to explain myself. I would say something simple, something honest, and the room would go still. Then someone would smile and reframe my words in a way that made me sound confused. Someone else would smile and add context I never meant. Another would smile and suggest I was stressed, emotional, tired. By the time they were done, my own words no longer belonged to me. And if I pushed back, even gently, the smiles changed shape. They became patient, sympathetic, concerned. The kind of smiles people use when they believe they are dealing with someone fragile, someone unstable, someone who doesn't see things clearly. That was the trap. Because once they agreed I was the problem, everything I did became evidence. If I stayed quiet, I was sulking. If I spoke up, I was overreacting. If I cried, I was proving their point. If I stayed calm, I was being passive-aggressive. There was no response left that didn't serve the story they were building. I could feel myself shrinking in real time. They started talking about me instead of to me. Always kindly. Always with concern. Always smiling. They discussed what was best for me, what I could handle, what I needed to work on. I was present for these conversations, but invisible inside them, like a child sitting at a table where adults decide her future. And the worst part was that they sounded reasonable. If someone had overheard them, they would have thought I was lucky to be so cared for, so supported, so gently guided. No one would have heard the control underneath. No one would have seen how my voice was slowly being replaced by theirs. The coordination became clearest when I realized they remembered a version of events I didn't recognize. Stories I knew hadn't happened the way they described. Feelings they claimed I expressed that I never did. reactions they attributed to me that felt foreign. When I tried to correct them, they smiled and assured me I was mistaken. That's when fear entered the picture. Not fear of them, fear of myself. I started questioning my memory, wondering if I really had said that, if I really had reacted that way, if maybe I was more unstable than I realized. Their smiles were so confident, so united, and I was alone inside my doubt. The damage didn't come from one cruel act. It came from repetition, from consistency, from the quiet agreement that I was the weak link. And once that agreement existed, it didn't matter what I did anymore. The outcome was decided. I felt myself becoming smaller just to survive conversations, choosing words carefully, softening my tone, smiling back even when my stomach hurt. I learned that matching their smiles was safer than questioning them. So I did. And that's how I disappeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but piece by piece, while everyone around me looked pleasant and calm, while they told me they loved me, while they insisted they only wanted what was best. What they wanted was compliance. What they needed was someone to carry what they didn't want to face. And because I had always been the one who endured quietly, they assumed I always would. I didn't realize then that this coordination wasn't accidental. It was easier to agree than to reflect, easier to label me than to look inward, easier to keep smiling together than to admit how much damage they were doing. By the time I sensed the full weight of it, the narrative was already set. The smiles had done their work. The damage was no longer hidden. It was built into how they saw me. And still, they smiled. That's what made it unbearable. Because when harm comes wrapped in kindness, you don't just lose your footing, you lose your reality. And I was standing on the edge of that loss, not yet knowing how much more I was about to lose, or how close I was to finally seeing the truth they never wanted me to see. Isolation doesn't happen all at once. If it did, you'd fight it. You'd question it. You'd notice it clearly. What happened to me was quieter than that. It crept in while everyone was still smiling, while conversations sounded normal, while nothing looked wrong from the outside. At first I just felt left out. Little things. Messages that didn't come. Plans I heard about after they already happened. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. No one said I wasn't welcome. No one told me to stay away. I was simply no longer considered. And when I noticed, I blamed myself. I told myself I was being dramatic, that people drift apart, that I was too sensitive to changes that didn't matter. I reminded myself of all the times I'd been told I overthink. So I swallowed the feeling and kept smiling back. But the distance kept growing. When I did show up, something had shifted. The warmth was gone. Not replaced by anger, just by politeness. The kind of politeness that keeps you at arm's length. The kind that lets people say they're being nice while making sure you don't belong. I started to feel like I was walking on glass. Every word felt risky. Every reaction felt like it could be misunderstood. I watched myself constantly, adjusting my tone, my expressions, my timing. I was trying to earn comfort that used to be automatic. That's when the blame began to surface. Not directly. Never directly. It came in the form of concern. Someone would smile and say they were worried about me. Another would suggest I seemed stressed lately. Someone else would hint that I'd changed, that I wasn't as easygoing as before, that I seemed distant. No one acknowledged the distance they had created. Instead, it was framed as my issue, my mood, my behavior, my energy. The more isolated I felt, the more proof they seemed to have that something was wrong with me. I tried to explain once, carefully, calmly. I said I felt left out. I said I didn't understand what had changed. I said I wanted to fix it. The response was immediate and devastating. They smiled. They reassured me. They told me nothing was wrong. Then they gently suggested that maybe I was projecting. Maybe I was insecure. Maybe I needed to work on myself. The conversation ended with me apologizing for bringing it up. That's when I realized the blame was no longer accidental. It had direction. From that point on, everything I did was filtered through the idea that I was difficult, If I stayed quiet, I was being cold. If I spoke up, I was creating tension. If I tried to reconnect, I was needy. If I pulled back, I was dramatic. There was no version of me that didn't confirm the story they were telling, and the isolation deepened. People stopped checking in, stopped asking questions, stopped including me in decisions that affected everyone. I wasn't part of the inner circle anymore. I was an afterthought at best, a complication at worst. The hardest part was realizing they talked about me when I wasn't there. I could feel it in the way conversations shifted when I arrived, in the way explanations sounded rehearsed, in the way concern had already been shared and agreed upon. I didn't know exactly what was being said, but I knew the conclusion. I was the problem. That belief settled into the group like fact. And once it didn't need proof anymore. Everything became confirmation. My silence, my sadness, my confusion, even my attempts to stay calm were used against me. I started spending more time alone, not because I wanted to, but because being around them hurt too much. And then that choice was used as evidence too. I was isolating myself, they said. I was pulling away. I was difficult to reach. No one noticed that I was doing it to survive. I felt like I was watching my life through glass. Still present, but not participating. Still smiling, but empty behind it. I missed people who were still alive, and still smiling at me. That kind of grief is hard to explain. There's no goodbye, no closure, just a slow disappearance. I began to question my worth, not in dramatic ways, in quiet ones. I wondered if I really was too much, if maybe I drained people, if maybe love always came with conditions and I was just failing to meet them. The isolation worked exactly as it was meant to. It made me doubt myself. It made me small. It made me compliant. It made me easier to dismiss. And the more isolated I became, the easier it was for everyone else to stay comfortable with the story they had chosen. What hurt the most was how calm it all was. No fights, no shouting, no obvious cruelty. Just distance, blame, and smiles that said everything was fine. Anyone looking in would have seen a normal family. They wouldn't have seen the way I was being quietly erased. By the time I fully understood what was happening, I felt trapped inside it. Speaking up only made things worse. Staying quiet made me invisible. I was carrying the weight of blame alone, and no one seemed interested in sharing it. That's when I started to feel something new beneath the pain. Not anger, not strength, but a growing awareness that this wasn't about fixing anything anymore. It was about whether I could survive being blamed for a damage I didn't cause. And I didn't yet know how close I was to the moment that would finally force me to choose myself or disappear completely. The breaking point didn't arrive with a scream. It arrived with exhaustion. I remember the exact feeling. Not the date, not the place, but the weight. It felt like carrying something too heavy for too long and suddenly realizing my hands were empty because whatever I had been holding was never mine to carry. I had spent years trying to fix a problem that wasn't real, apologizing for damage I didn't cause, shrinking to make other people comfortable. And one day, my body refused to keep pretending. The moment itself was small, almost embarrassing in how ordinary it was. Someone smiled at me and said something gentle, something concerned, something that blamed me without sounding like blame. Normally, I would have nodded. Normally, I would have swallowed the feeling and gone home to cry alone. But this time, something inside me went still. I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. For the first time, I didn't rush to explain myself. I didn't search my memory for mistakes. I didn't adjust my tone or soften my reaction. I just listened. And as I listened, I heard it. Not just the words, but the pattern, the same calm delivery, the same careful framing, the same smile used to disguise control. And suddenly, it all connected. The smiles weren't kindness, they were strategy. They weren't misunderstanding me. They were defining me. They weren't worried about me. They were protecting themselves. That realization hit hard. Harder than any insult ever had. Because it meant the pain wasn't accidental. It wasn't a series of unfortunate moments. It was consistent, intentional, maintained. I looked back at everything with new eyes. Every time my feelings were dismissed as sensitivity, every time my concerns were reframed as insecurity, every time distance was blamed on my behavior instead of theirs. It wasn't confusion. It was a system, and I had been stuck inside it for years. The truth was devastating, but also grounding. I wasn't losing my mind. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't broken. I had been placed in a role, the weak one, the emotional one, the problem. And once that role existed, everything I did was interpreted through it. No amount of kindness, silence, or effort could undo that. Because the role served them. Seeing that truth hurt more than denial ever did. I grieved instantly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just deeply. I grieved the version of love I thought I had. I grieved the years I spent trying to earn safety from people who benefited from my self-doubt. I grieved the part of myself that kept hoping this would change if I just tried harder. That part of me finally went quiet. And in that quiet, something else surfaced. Anger didn't come first. Strength didn't either. What came first was relief. A strange, heavy relief. Because once I saw the truth, I didn't have to keep explaining myself anymore. I didn't have to keep solving a puzzle that was designed to confuse me. I noticed how differently my body reacted after that moment. My chest didn't tighten the same way. My thoughts didn't spiral as fast. I still felt pain, but it no longer came with self-hatred. It came with understanding. And understanding changes everything. The smiles didn't stop after that. If anything, they became more intense, warmer, more exaggerated. It was like they sensed the shift before I said a word. Like they knew something had changed and wanted to smooth it over before it turned into resistance. The concern increased. The sweetness thickened. And that confirmed it, because when someone is truly innocent, they don't need to maintain the image so carefully. I stopped reacting the way I used to. I answered simply. I didn't defend. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain my feelings in detail anymore. I just existed as myself. And that small change disrupted everything. The tone shifted. The patience thinned. The smiles strained. That's when I knew for sure. The version of me they needed was the one who doubted herself. The one who carried blame. The one who stayed soft enough to bend. The moment I stopped playing that role, even quietly, the truth became visible. I wasn't loved for who I was. I was valued for what I absorbed. That realization broke my heart. But it also gave it back to me. Because once the truth is exposed, you can't unsee it. You can't return to confusion. You can't keep calling harm by softer names. You can't keep mistaking control for care. I didn't confront anyone that day. I didn't need to. The confrontation happened inside me. And it changed the way I stood, the way I listened, the way I decided what I would tolerate. The breaking point wasn't loud, but it was final. From that moment on, the destruction no longer felt invisible. I could see it clearly, even when it hid behind smiles. And that clarity came with a terrifying question I could no longer avoid. If staying meant continuing to play a role that erased me, what would happen if I stopped? I didn't know the answer yet, but I knew the truth now, and that truth would not let me go back. Choosing distance didn't feel like freedom. It felt like failure. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to walk away. There was no big announcement, no dramatic moment where I finally stood up and said enough. Distance entered my life quietly, the same way the damage had. One small decision at a time. One moment where I didn't reach out. One message I didn't send. One explanation I didn't offer. At first, it felt wrong. My whole body resisted it. I had been trained to fix things, to smooth tension, to restore balance. Creating distance felt like breaking an unspoken rule. It felt selfish. It felt dangerous. And the guilt came fast. I told myself I was being cruel, that I was overreacting, that I was punishing people who didn't mean to hurt me. Years of conditioning didn't disappear just because I saw the truth. Every step back came with a wave of doubt. whispering that I was the real problem after all. The cost showed up immediately. The smiles disappeared. Not all at once, not openly, but the warmth cooled. The politeness turned stiff. The concern turned sharp. My absence was noticed, but not questioned with care. It was treated as confirmation. Proof that I was difficult. Proof that I was dramatic. Proof that I couldn't be counted on. No one asked why I needed space. They just decided what it meant. That hurt more than I expected. I had secretly hoped that distance might spark curiosity, that someone would check in, that someone would ask if I was okay. Instead, my silence was used against me. The story adjusted easily to include my absence. I felt replaceable. That realization hit deep. I had spent years holding things together, absorbing tension, carrying emotional weight. I thought that mattered. I thought it would be noticed. But when I stepped back, the system didn't collapse. It adapted, and that adaptation hurt more than the loss itself. The loneliness was intense. Distance didn't just separate me from them. It separated me from the version of myself that believed I was needed. Without the role I had played for so long, I felt untethered. I didn't know who I was if I wasn't fixing, soothing, explaining. There were nights when I stared at my phone, fighting the urge to reach out just to feel connected. Not because I believed things would change, but because silence felt unbearable. Distance removes distraction. It forces you to sit with grief instead of managing other people's emotions. And grief is heavy. I grieved conversations that would never happen. I grieved apologies that would never come. I grieved the family I thought I had, not the one that actually existed. Letting go of that illusion felt like losing something twice. The guilt didn't leave quickly. It followed me into everything. I questioned whether I was heartless, whether I was abandoning people who loved me in their own way, whether I would regret this choice forever. Some days, the doubt was louder than the peace. But something else began to grow in the space distance created. Clarity. Without constant exposure to subtle criticism and quiet blame, my thoughts slowed down. I noticed how much tension had lived in my body, how often I had braced myself without realizing it, how rarely I had felt calm in their presence. Distance gave me room to observe instead of react. And what I observed was painful, but undeniable. The relationship only worked when I carried the weight. When I stopped, there was nothing to replace it. That truth hurt. It meant the connection wasn't mutual. It meant my value had been tied to how much I could endure. It meant the love I fought for had conditions I could no longer meet without hurting myself. Distance also came with judgment. From others. From myself. People don't understand walking away from something that looks fine on the outside. There were no visible scars. No dramatic stories. Just a quiet decision that didn't make sense to anyone who hadn't lived it. I learned quickly that choosing distance meant choosing to be misunderstood. Some days, that misunderstanding felt heavier than the original pain. At least before, I knew my role. Now, I was alone with my choice, carrying consequences without validation. But slowly, very slowly, something shifted. I noticed moments of peace I hadn't felt before. Small moments, sitting in silence without anxiety, making decisions without fear of judgment, feeling emotions without immediately correcting them. These moments were fragile, but real. The cost of distance was high. Loneliness, grief, guilt, being misunderstood. But staying had cost me my sense of self. And as painful as distance was, it wasn't erasing me. It was giving me back to myself, piece by piece. I didn't know yet what the future would look like. I didn't know if the distance would be permanent. All I knew was that going back would require me to become small again. And I had already learned the price of that. Choosing distance didn't make the pain disappear. It just stopped it from continuing. And that, as painful as it was, felt like the first real act of care I had ever given myself. The aftermath was not relief. That's the part people don't talk about. When you finally step away from the people who quietly broke you, you don't immediately feel free. You feel empty. You feel untethered. You feel like a house after a storm, standing but hollow. unsure which walls are still safe to lean on. The silence after distance was different from the silence before. Before, silence felt like punishment. After, it felt like loss. I woke up some mornings forgetting, just for a second, that everything had changed. My body would reach for the old reflexes, the urge to explain myself, the urge to check my phone, the urge to prepare for judgment that was no longer coming. And then it would hit me again. I didn't belong to that version of my life anymore. That realization hurt in waves. I grieved more than people. I grieved an identity. For most of my life, I had been the quiet one, the understanding one, the one who didn't cause problems, the one who absorbed discomfort so others wouldn't have to. When that role disappeared, I didn't know who I was without it. I felt useless, directionless, strangely guilty for not suffering anymore. Some nights, the pain came back so strong it scared me. I missed people who had hurt me. Not because they were good to me, but because they were familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown peace. I had to admit that truth to myself before I could move forward. There were moments I almost went back. Moments where loneliness felt louder than self-respect. Moments where I thought maybe I had exaggerated everything. Maybe I really was the problem. That voice was not new. It was trained, and it didn't disappear just because the environment changed. Healing was not inspirational. It was slow and uncomfortable. I had to learn how to sit with my own thoughts without correcting them. I had to learn that my emotions didn't need approval to exist. I had to stop flinching when I felt joy, waiting for someone to soften it, minimize it, or take it away. I started noticing how much of my personality had been shaped by survival. How many choices I made based on avoiding conflict instead of honoring myself. How often I had smiled automatically, even when no one was watching. The hardest part was rebuilding trust with myself. I didn't trust my reactions. I didn't trust my instincts. I didn't trust that I deserved peace. So I rebuilt slowly, carefully, one decision at a time. I let myself like things without explaining why. I let myself say no without apologizing. I let myself feel anger without turning it inward. These moments felt unnatural at first, like wearing someone else's clothes. But over time, they started to fit. There were days I felt strong. There were days I felt broken all over again. Healing didn't erase the past. It just stopped it from defining my future. What surprised me most was realizing how much lighter my body felt. How my shoulders dropped. How my breathing slowed. How my nervous system finally rested after years of being on guard. That's when I understood something important. The damage had lived inside me longer than I realized. And so did the strength. I wasn't weak for being kind. I wasn't broken for being sensitive. I wasn't wrong for wanting love without conditions. Those qualities didn't destroy me. They were used against me. Rebuilding my identity meant reclaiming those parts without shame. It meant learning that empathy doesn't require self-sacrifice, that loyalty doesn't mean silence, that love should not cost you your sense of self. I still have scars. Some days I still hesitate. Some smiles still make me uneasy. Some silences still feel heavy. But now, when that happens, I don't disappear. I stay. I don't know if the people who hurt me understand what they did. I don't know if they ever will. And I no longer need them to. Closure didn't come from being understood. It came from choosing myself even when it hurt. If you're still watching this, maybe you're standing in the aftermath too. Maybe you walked away quietly. Maybe you stayed too long. Maybe you're still smiling while breaking inside. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. You are not weak for surviving quietly. But you deserve a life where you don't have to. Rebuilding yourself after quiet destruction is painful, lonely, slow, but it is possible. And one day, you wake up and realize something incredible. They no longer define you. The damage no longer directs you. And the smile you wear now is finally real.